My hope in this presentation is to give you an overview of some of the other types or methods for conducting educational research. So as we've talked about, we've referenced this chart a couple times from the Creswell text. We have the major traditions of quantitative, qualitative, and then combined or mixed methods research. And then each of those can be further broken down into different methods. And one of the things that I wanted to point out, and you'll have access to these slides, is that as you're reading research, sometimes it can be difficult to identify what kind of methods are being used. And in the Creswell text, one of the most beneficial pieces, I think, are the example studies that he provides so that you can see what does a correlation study look like? What does a survey study look like? So at the end of each of the chapters, you have these specific studies. And you may want to reference those as you're reading your own research to just benchmark, do I have the right type of methods here? Does this match what I'm seeing? So let's talk about an example, and this was on our agenda for last week, but we didn't get a chance to get to it. You're a math coach and an interventionist for two K-8 schools in a large district. You observe that the students at Riverview School have higher performance on the geometry portions of the state assessment than the students at Woodside School. Both schools use the same math curriculum, but the Riverview School is also using iPads in math. You're curious about why there is a difference in performance. You think of the following ways to investigate this issue. So there's 4 options here that I've given you. Option A, option B, option C, option D. And what I'd encourage you to do right now is pause the video and try and figure out which of these are quantitative, which are qualitative, and which are mixed methods. And just make yourself a note before you go on with the video. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is just kind of back up and talk about quantitative research. Remember, is describing a relationship of variables. The literature review plays a major role. Narrowly defined and observable issue, data is numerical, samples large, instruments must be valid and reliable, and you're doing statistical analysis. You've seen this chart a few times, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it here, but feel free to pause and take down any notes you want. Qualitative research, on the other hand, is the goal of exploring and understanding. The literature review does not determine the methods, and a hypothesis is not usually made. It's an open-ended approach. Usually you're looking at audio, images, and language-based data, and you're coding the data for themes and interpreting those themes into findings. And you have to be aware of your own bias and that sort of bring your reflexivity to the work. Again, you've seen this chart a few times, so just those big major pieces to keep in mind with qualitative research. Mixed methods, on the other hand, we touched on briefly, but is when you combine the two. And there's kind of 3 major types: explanatory, exploratory, and triangulation. In explanatory, you're doing your quantitative collection first and then moving on to a qualitative. In exploratory, you're typically doing a smaller qualitative piece first, then moving on to quantitative. And then in triangulation, you're typically doing them simultaneously to understand the issue. So let's go back to our example here that I gave you before, and let's walk through which each option is. So option A is a quantitative examination of the issue. You would be doing a survey of the parents about the schooling, and then look for a relationship pattern with the performance of the student and the level of school of the parents. Option B is also quantitative, but this is more of an intervention approach or experimental approach that we'll get into in a minute, because you're trying something new and gathering data on the changes. Option C would be the qualitative study of the issue. You're listening to the variety of stakeholders in the situation and listening to their words to understand. And then in option D, this would be a mixed methods. You would be doing a triangulation probably in this approach. You'd be gathering the quantitative data and qualitative data at the same time to try and more fully understand the issue. So now what I'm going to do is try and just give you a brief highlight for each of the chapters 10 through 15, and then also to 17, because mixed is 16, so we've done that. Chapter 10, experimental designs, is when you are trying something to see if it impacts the situation. It's a type of quantitative research typically. And one of the biggest challenges is with this is that it's often really, really difficult to have a control group in education because there's typically there's other variables that impact it, and it's not just seeing the difference between two schools or two classrooms. So some important ideas about experimental design are listed below here. And if we were to take this same example of being a math coach and looking at an experimental design, the closest that we could maybe do is to try an implementation of iPads at the Woodside School to see what happens. But the big challenge here is, can you truly randomly assign students? What if all the students from a lower income neighborhood happen to be the students at Woodside School? And so it really has nothing to do with the iPads. It has to do with the difference of socioeconomic standing and other variables. And how would you control all the variables? What other extraneous variables are there? And you might also want to consider what threats to validity would exist in this experiment. But you could do what's kind of called a quasi-experimental design if you wanted to try an implementation study. In chapter 11, you would read about the correlational design. A correlation is where you're exploring a specific relationship. The most common is called the Pearson's product moment correlation. It's a mathematical relationship, and it has kind of these different looks to where you are displaying the data visually and looking at the strength of the association in terms of if one piece goes up, does the other. So for instance, if we increase the number of minutes at recess, do we then see a decrease in the sort of off-task behaviors of students? You know, would we see a negative correlation in that case? So for our study about the math coach and interventionist, for a Pearson correlation, you're linking values. So perhaps you could look at minutes using the iPad and score on geometry portion of test. And that might give you a sense of their relationship, but one of the most important things to realize is that correlation does not equal causation. So you can't necessarily say at the end of that more minutes on the iPad equal a better score in geometry. It's just simply that there was a relationship that you observed. And so that's a challenge with correlational design, but sometimes it helps to provide a picture of what's going on with your data. Within chapter 11, one thing I wanted to comment on was a meta-analysis. A meta-analysis is basically a research study that synthesizes other research studies, and it's typically using a form of correlational research. And a meta-analysis is using the other studies as the data and doing the calculations on their findings. So it's more than just a literature review on the topic. But if you are unsure, if you're reading a meta-analysis, I'm happy to help you look at that. But these pages in the text will be very helpful if indeed you are trying to use that for one of your matrix or annotations. A survey, you've all participated in surveys. There are a few different times, whether you're doing a cross-sectional or a longitudinal survey. It's an efficient method to gather data, but the design of your instruments is going to be the sort of limiting factor, as is your response rate, and then also your response bias. Typically to a survey, you get your lovers and your haters, and it's important to think about why are they motivated to respond, and therefore, does it represent everyone's belief or just someone who's had a very positive or very negative experience. So if we go back to our math coach sample, or example, for who might use survey, you could potentially do parents, teachers, students, admins, or potentially more than one group of those. You could focus on a whole variety of topics: home access to technology, attitudes, approaches, highest level of schooling in the home. One of the things you have to keep in mind with survey research, and actually really any research, is at the end, what would you not know through the survey? Because when you're surveying, you are relying on the participants to be accurate and honest with their data, and that is not always the case. People sometimes either over or underinflate their perception of an issue. So sometimes we're left not knowing things, but still a strong methodology and often used in educational research. Grounded theory is a type of qualitative data analysis, and it has to do with the fact that instead of sort of imposing upon your data what you think might be there, it's really trying to build your theory from the ground up, or what are called in vivo, which means from the participants, their words, to build your understanding of the issue. So it's often a methodology that you see used in qualitative research. It is more exploratory and constructivist, and so you might read one of those studies in your matrix or annotations, or you might even decide to use a grounded theory approach to your data analysis in the next year. With grounded theory, in our example, you're typically trying to document the process, and so for this, it might be trying to capture the process of implementing one-to-one iPads. It wouldn't necessarily be trying to document the reasons for the difference between the two schools, but rather to look at the process of change in education, and really looking for what patterns do you see in the process. In chapter 14, Creswell goes over ethnographic design, which is, again, a qualitative methodology where you're looking at a shared culture or a group with a shared experience or a shared characteristic, such as African American women who are principals. Okay, there might be a culture sharing piece there. It may be parents of children with disabilities. And there's a couple different types. And sometimes the access is the biggest issue with this kind of research. But again, you're looking to document the experience from the insider's perspectives to really give in-depth data on a specific group. So back to the ethnography, or back to the example and how you might do that with an ethnography. For this, for which approach might you use? Depending on the population of the two schools and teachers, my guess would probably be that you'd be looking at a case study approach within ethnography to try and document the differences here. And that is really to document what's happening inside the two schools that might contribute to this difference, and help you understand why there's a difference in performance. But you'd have to consider what issues of culture are present in the group, and there may be a compelling reason to use a different ethnographic approach if you wanted. Narrative should be comfortable to you as just sort of a general term in English, with telling of stories. There's many forms. I encourage you to take a look at this chart on page 506. It's figure 5.1. And it's really useful in education to capture the complexity of schools. And it's sort of a storytelling approach to finding the themes and patterns that happen within a context. So for our example with narrative design, you might be looking at a much longer period of data collection to capture the complexity of what's happening in this situation. And again, this is one of those places where you're going to have to consider what's your role within the research, and if you are a teacher in one of these schools, that can be a challenging way to approach research, and so sometimes a narrative can help tell that story more fully. Chapter 17 is action research, and I'm going to go ahead and pause the video here and start again in just a minute with a last video to finish out the content.